What the heck is up, everyone? It's Jacob here, and in this video I really want to highlight some of the differences between an analog scope, like a completely analog scope, and a digital storage oscilloscope. And a lot of people don't realize this because they think all scopes that have like cathode ray tubes in them are analog scopes, and that's really not the case. Down here is a completely analog scope. This is a Tektronix 2213, and up here is a digital storage oscilloscope. So this is an older analog scope, obviously, with a CRT tube in it, but it has digital storage capabilities. It actually has the ability to store signals in it. And so there is a massive difference in capabilities between these two scopes. So I really want to just produce this video for a lot of beginners or hobbyists or whatever, if you're going and purchasing your first scope, just so you understand some of the differences, and so you're not too disappointed if you buy your first scope in its capabilities. You're not too disappointed in what it can do, because there is a major difference between this type of a scope and this type of a scope, and really the amount of work you can do with each of them is completely different. So I don't really want to get into a lot of the technicalities in this video, because there are a lot of videos about the technicalities behind oscilloscopes, but I want to kind of show the differences in operation behind these scopes and show how they operate differently. Alright guys, so let's go ahead and take a look at these two scopes. So the one on the bottom, of course, is our full analog scope, and the first thing you'll notice is that it has significantly less controls. And that is because this has almost twice as many controls, right? A lot of the controls on here have to do with the actual digital storage and cursors and things like that. And I don't want to get too much into the operation of these two scopes and how they operate differently. That might be another video, but there are lots of videos on how oscilloscopes operate. But there is a lot more complexity to the digital storage scope and how to operate it. It's not nearly as simple as this. There's a lot more things to worry about in a digital storage oscilloscope. And essentially, this scope is going to operate just like a modern scope, no different. This scope will operate no different than any modern digital storage oscilloscope with a modern like LCD and an FPGA or whatever. Anything that's doing all software signal processing, it should operate exactly the same as this. The capabilities of that scope may be far greater than this scope, but it will operate. The principles of operation are nearly the same. So let's go ahead and take a look at these two scopes. So again, there's significantly less controls. So what I want to do is I have both of these scopes here. This, again, is the digital storage scope, and I have no digital storage capabilities turned on right now. So it is operating as a pure analog scope. None of the digital storage is turned on, okay? And so I have the same signal being fed into both these scopes. So throughout the entire video, they will both have the exact same signal being fed into them. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. So what I have right now is a 1 kilohertz sine wave being fed into both of these scopes. And as you can see, it looks quite good on both of them, right? There's not too much of a difference. Really, there is no difference. They are showing exactly the same signal, and it looks great on both of them. It's a very usable signal. And so if I zoom out a little bit, it still looks pretty good, right? So this is still that same 1 kilohertz sine wave. And as I zoom out a little bit more, it still looks pretty good, right? A little bit of a flicker. It's more noticeable on camera than it is in real life, but as I zoom out one more time, there is a very noticeable flicker now. Quite noticeable on both of them, right? And you might wonder, why would you ever want to zoom out that far in a waveform? Well, let's go ahead and look at a lower frequency. I'm going to go ahead and put in 60 hertz here. So here is 60 hertz. Now, this is mains US power here. This is the exact frequency that mains US power runs on, and so it would look exactly like this. And it's actually more flicker noticeable in real life than there is on camera. It's very hard to see on camera right now, but if I zoomed out of this waveform now, you can see there's a quite apparent flicker on both of these screens here, and it's very hard on the eyes. It's very hard to look at for a long period of time. Alright, so you can start to already see the limitations of a non-digital storage oscilloscope. If I zoom out a little bit more, that frequency or that delay becomes quite more apparent. And this is really just because of the way these scopes operate, really. There is a beam, right? And I should show you this. I'm going to go ahead and slow the time way down. On this bottom scope here, I'm going to go ahead and put it to ground. And I'm going to slow the time base way down there. And so you can see that there's just a dot sweeping across the screen, and we call this the actual beam. So there's a cathode ray tube on here that has a beam that's projected on the screen, and this beam moving across the screen is what produces our actual waveform. As we begin to speed it up, right? Or I could show you guys the actual signal being fed in here, and you can see it's bouncing back and forth according to our input frequency, or our input on this first channel here. And as I turn that time base up, speed it up there, you can see that it sweeps across the screen a lot faster. But it is that beam sweeping across the screen which creates our actual image that we see. And that beam can only go across the screen so fast on lower frequencies. So on lower frequencies, it's very difficult to actually analyze these waves. If I turn it down to 50 hertz, this is the European grid power. So it's very hard to actually look at these waveforms. And any frequency lower than this is just obviously going to be even harder to look at. Here's 20 hertz. Look at, and it's almost to the point where it's unusable, right? It's very difficult to look at that and to actually analyze that. It's very difficult. And same with the top one. But now here's where it shines. If I turn the digital storage on the top scope, let's go ahead and take a look at it. That waveform, same exact waveform, looks perfect on this scope. And really, this digital storage kind of allows us to like almost freeze time, right? What this scope up here is doing is it's basically instead of taking the actual voltage in real time and displaying that voltage across the screen, what it's doing is it's actually going to take this same very voltage and it's going to sample it, right? It's going to sample the voltage at a bunch of points. And again, I don't really want to get into the technicalities behind digital storage. There are a lot of good videos by EEV blog and various other YouTubers that explain this quite well. So I don't want to get into the actual technicalities behind that. Perhaps I'll do another video, but there are some very good videos on that already. But essentially, here's what's going on. This waveform is being sampled, right? And it's being sampled at many points, and those points are being stored in actual memory in this oscilloscope. And essentially what it's doing is it's taking this waveform, sampling it, storing it, and then once it has this entire time frame stored from the beginning, so this entire frame that we're viewing, or even more than that, if you want to turn the memory sample up, so you can actually turn the storage depth up or down on this scope. You can select between 1 and 4K. I don't really want to get into the technicalities behind that, but essentially what we can do is it's storing these in memory, and then once it has that entire waveform stored over this whole period, it's going to display it, and it's just going to sweep across the screen really fast and display this image at a very fast sweep rate, if you will. It's just going to sweep across the screen very fast, and it's going to have a high refresh rate. So it's going to refresh this waveform at a much higher pace to the point where it's the flicker or this actual movement is unnoticeable, right? Because it's not really displaying this waveform in real time like this one is. This one's relying on an actual signal to be there, whereas this one is taking your signal, sampling it, storing it in memory. Once it has all that signal stored in memory, it's going to display what is in memory, not the actual signal in real time. So there is a little bit of a delay there in that digital storage scope. Alright guys, so here we're looking at a burst signal for my signal generator, and essentially here's what's going on. This signal generator is feeding out the same, let me look at it. It's feeding out 60 hertz. So it's feeding out the same 60 hertz, but it's only going to burst out 3 cycles of 60 hertz. So it's going to do 3 full cycles of 60 hertz. Then there's going to be a 100 millisecond delay, and it's going to put out another 3 cycles. So it's basically doing 3 cycle bursts of 60 hertz sine waves in intervals of 10 milliseconds, or 100 millisecond delays. And as you can see, again, this falls into that repetitiveness. This waveform is somewhat repetitive. It is happening, the same thing is happening over and over again, but it's not extremely repetitive, right? There is quite a delay between these repetitive waveforms, and it's very hard to see this waveform on the oscilloscope. It's almost impossible for me to catch it. I can zoom in a little bit, right? And you can see that, oh, okay, there's some cycles right there, but it's not really easy for me to see all the cycles. It's not easy for me to see this gap between. If I zoom out a little bit, we can kind of see it. If I do a little bit of trigger hold, that helps it a little bit. it's not as messy, but it triggers better. But you can see that it's kind of hard to see. I can see, okay, there's half a cycle there, or maybe a full cycle, and there's a couple other cycles there. It's hard for me to see this actual time in between. You can see it's very difficult to analyze this. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's borderline, right? This is very difficult to look at on this scope. Same with this top one, but if I turn it into storage mode here, let's go ahead and do that. And I think we're in 4K. So yeah, so here. So if I have it like this, and I'm just going to go ahead and save this, I can actually save this. That's another great thing about the digital storage. You can save all your sample points, so you can look at a waveform. It'll store it in memory, I can save it, and I no longer have to have the actual signal. We can actually unplug the signal, because again, it's not displaying anything in real time. This is all stored in memory. And the bottom one, if you ever unplug the signal on a completely analog scope, you're done. You cannot display it, because it's displaying the actual voltage at the BNC on that channel in real time, right? And so this is another case where that digital storage really comes in handy, because we can look at waveforms like this that are really repetitive and would be very hard to actually analyze on a scope like this, because it has that slow refresh rate, right? And so really, if we look at it on here, if I turn the cursors on, I can scroll through this waveform in great detail and actually analyze it, right? I can look at it in great depth. And I can look at it, I can look at the time, I can measure the time between it, and it actually has these cursors, and these cursors, I don't know if you can see it, but this little box right here, it has a little jog wheel right here, and I can move this cursor along the waveform, and there's two of them, so if I hit one right there, I can get the other one, so there's two of them. Let me find where that other one went. So there's one right there, and there's one right here. And with these two cursors, I can find the differences in voltage levels between those two cursors. I can find the differences in time, and it'll display all that information right here, okay? So on the top, you can see right there, it's showing me the actual difference in voltage. So between here and here, the difference is 2.4 volts. I'm not sure how good you can see that on camera. And the difference in time is 15.5 milliseconds. So if I went to the very beginning of when this kind of delay started here, and to the very end, it'll show me there is 50 milliseconds of delay between these waveforms, and so it shows the exact time. You can get exact values with this digital storage scope. It shows the exact voltages, it shows the time. You can get real values, whereas here you kind of have to rely on that grid, right? It's not impossible, but you're really guesstimating. You can try and adjust all the controls to get it as fine as you want to match that grid as good as you can. Really, in the end, you're just guesstimating based on this grid on the bottom scope, whereas in the top one you can get really real actual values based on these cursors, and we can really scroll through this wave in great depth. And I can actually take this waveform and store it in memory and look at it later if I wanted to. And I can compare it against other waveforms. So I can take this waveform, store it in memory, and then compare it against another waveform in real time if I wanted to. That's what's really nice about digital storage. Again, this is just, it's not something you may need, but it depends on your use, and there's a vast difference here. This is almost unusable. I wouldn't say it's completely unusable, but analyzing the signal is going to be very hard, and we can't really scroll through this waveform. I can't put the actual, I can't put these three sine waves next to each other. I can try and adjust the trigger a little bit, but that's about the best I can do. Alright guys, and very last here, I just want to show you guys one more example where the analog scope is completely actually useless. So we kind of went from where the analog scope was useful, right? It wasn't too bad, where we had that repetitive 1 kilohertz sine wave, or even down to, like I said, about 30 hertz. The completely analog scope is quite useful, right? So as long as your waveform's repetitive or partly repetitive, right? We saw with that burst, it was still somewhat useful. It was kind of intermittent there. You can see it was, I would say, borderline useful. It was almost useless, the signal, when we had that burst waveform. But in this case, this is going to be some very transient waveform that I'm going to look at. And so this is an LC circuit right here. It's just going to be some LC oscillators. So we have an inductor and a capacitor. And basically, I have my power supply hooked up here, and I have my oscilloscopes both hooked up here as well. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to touch one of the leads of the other lead of my power supply to this, and it's going to charge up this circuit. And this circuit's essentially going to ring. I don't want to explain all the technicalities behind that, because that's really out of the scope of this video, and it doesn't matter. But what I would just want to show you guys, what I want to explain, is this circuit's going to charge up and it's going to oscillate. And basically what it's going to do is it's going to lose the power in the circuit due to inefficiencies in the inductor and the actual capacitor itself. It'll lose energy, and the amplitudes will start out quite high, and they will get smaller. And all this is going to happen in a very short period of time. And something that's, like I said, very transient, very fast. It's something that's going to happen almost instantaneously. And this is absolutely 100% impossible to do on a completely analog scope. Without a digital storage component, you will see that there's no way we could actually analyze this waveform on a analog scope. So I want to show you guys the differences here. Alright guys, so I have both scopes set up here. They're both not in digital storage, so I'm gonna grab my circuit here, and I'm gonna try and do this real quick. So let me go ahead and let's see here. Alright guys, so I can touch it, and as you can see, you can kind of see almost barely. You can see that waveform going across the screen. You can kind of see something, right? You can see a lot of pulses. You can see a big pulse, and you'll see a lot of smaller amplitude pulses coming after that. So you should see a really large pulse followed by a bunch of pulses coming after that. They're all sine waves. So it's just a bunch of AC sine wave pulses coming after that with a shrinking amplitude. So it's going to have a large amplitude with shrinking amplitudes. And that's just the energy being dissipated in this LC circuit. So let's go ahead and look at that one more time. You can kind of see it on the bottom scope. You can see it on the top scope as well, but it's almost damn near impossible to get any useful data out of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this thing in single sweep. So it's going to capture this as soon as it happens. It's just going to do a single sweep. As soon as it picks up a trigger level, this thing's going to do a single sweep across the screen. And I'm going to go ahead and put it in storage mode. And I have 4K of memory going here, so it's going to store all this into 4K of memory, 4K sample points, right? And so what it's going to do is it's going to, there it is. So it captured it and it saved it. And so now what we can do is we can actually look at this data. It's basically, like I said, paused in time. This is all something that happened in a very split second. Let's see. So if I put my cursor here, this is another thing that's really nice. I could put my cursor here, and I could say this is where it started. I push that, and I can bring my other cursor around over here. I don't know where it's at. Oh, there it is. And I could say, I lost most of its energy, let's just say by this point. So right here, all this happened. It had full energy to almost all of its energy dissipated in this LC circuit in about 3.6 milliseconds. So this whole thing happened in 3.6 milliseconds. And as you can see, it's oscillating at a frequency of, I don't even know what that is, it's going to be 1 over 2 pi square root of LC. That'll tell us the actual frequency, but that doesn't matter. My point is, I just want to show you guys the actual differences on these scopes. This is something that's absolutely impossible. There's no hope in capturing any of this data on this bottom scope. There's no way you'd be able to do something like this. So if you want to catch really fast transients, if you're into catching surge currents or surge voltages or something like that, something that happens very fast, if you wanted to analyze voltage spikes or anything like that, it's going to be impossible to do on this scope. On this scope, you can see that you can get a lot of information. There's almost night and day here. Alright guys, that pretty much wraps up for this one. I hope you guys found this video useful, and if you guys are definitely looking into getting maybe your first scope, or even if it's not your first scope and you're looking at getting a new oscilloscope, definitely keep some of these things in mind, because as you can see, the capabilities of these scopes are quite different. Again, there's nothing wrong with this bottom scope. It's definitely still a great scope, but it has its uses, right? It has certain situations where it's useful, and certain situations where it's just as useless as a rock. So, I hope you guys found this video helpful, and if you guys enjoyed it, definitely give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. I hope to see you guys in the next one, and as always, have a good one.